I grew up on a small farm in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was a mile down a dirt road, and the only sounds at night were the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a coyote. My parents had passed away when I was young, and I inherited the place, so I spent most of my adult life here alone. Most days were quiet and predictable. Feeding the animals, tending the fields, fixing fences, and making sure the old machinery didn't fall apart completely. I liked the solitude for the most part. It gave me space to think. But I also knew that loneliness had a way of magnifying even the smallest things into something much worse. It was early October when it happened, a time when the days were still warm but the nights had a sharp chill to them. I had spent all day in the barn, checking on the cows and cleaning out the stalls. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, and the sky had that deep orange glow that only happens in the fall. I left the barn and walked back toward the farmhouse, my boots crunching on the dry leaves that had already started to pile up along the driveway. I was tired, covered in sweat and dust, and ready to call it a night. I had just turned onto the porch when I noticed something strange. The chickens, which were usually huddled in their coop by now, were all over the yard, clucking and squawking like crazy. At first, I thought maybe a fox had gotten into the yard, but then I saw that all the gates were still closed, the fences were intact, and the dogs, Old Max and Young Scout, were nowhere near alarmed. That's when I realized that whatever was disturbing them wasn't obvious or easy to see. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the barn, thinking maybe one of the cows had gotten spooked or hurt itself. The beam of light cut through the dimness as I walked between the stalls. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping noise, like something dragging along the ground. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the farm, it sounded amplified. I froze, listening. Came from the back of the property, near the cornfield. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Still, something about the sound made my stomach twist. I grabbed an old hunting rifle from the corner of the barn, more for peace of mind than actual expectation of danger, and stepped outside. The air was cold now, sharp against my face, and the sun had almost disappeared behind the horizon. The scraping noise continued, slow and deliberate, moving along the edge of the field. I followed it, keeping my flashlight steady. The beam of light caught glimpses of the tall corn stalks swaying in the wind, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement between them. I called out, even though I knew no one would answer, but there was only silence apart from the scraping. When I reached the edge of the cornfield, I realized the sound had stopped. Everything was eerily still, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I stepped into the field, my boots sinking into the soft soil. The cornstalks towered over me, and the flashlight made shadows jump and twist in every direction. That's when I saw it. A set of footprints. They were large, heavier than mine, dragging along the ground in a way that didn't look natural. The prints weren't fresh. They had been there long enough for the edges to start crumbling. But the size and the dragging pattern made my stomach drop. Whoever or whatever made them wasn't normal. I followed the prints, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. They led to a small clearing at the edge of the field, near a grove of trees I rarely went near. There, I found the reason the chickens had been panicked. A section of the fence around the chicken coop had been torn apart. The wood was splintered and broken, and the ground was churned up as if some massive animal had forced its way through. Some of the chickens had managed to hide, but several were gone, and their feathers were scattered around like a storm had passed through. I stood there, frozen, trying to process it. There was no way it was a wild animal. Coyotes or foxes didn't have the strength to rip through that fence, and bears weren't common in this area. My mind raced. Maybe it was some drifters, people trying to steal the livestock, but the thought of someone sneaking around in the dark, dragging animals off my property, made my blood run cold. I went back inside the house and double-checked all the doors and windows. Everything seemed secure, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening. Every sound, the wind rattling the trees, a branch snapping in the yard, the distant howl of a coyote, made me jump. I didn't sleep until dawn, and even then, I kept my rifle within reach. The next day, I surveyed the damage. The coop needed repairs, and some chickens were missing, but nothing else seemed disturbed. I spent the day reinforcing the fences, setting traps along the edges of the property, and making sure the barn was as secure as it could be. By evening, I was exhausted, but I felt a little safer, or at least I told myself I did. It wasn't until the third night that it happened again. I had been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it clearly, the scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from the same direction as before. My chest tightened. I grabbed the rifle and crept to the window. Outside, I saw a dark shape moving near the edge of the cornfield. My flashlight revealed a man, hunched, moving carefully but with a strange, unnatural gait. He wasn't wearing anything that made him look like a normal farmer. His clothes were dark and tattered, and his face was obscured by a hood. I realized with horror that this wasn't an animal. It was a person, and he had been sneaking onto my property for who knows how long, stealing or harming my animals. The thought made my stomach turn. I aimed the rifle carefully, trying not to make a sound. When I squeezed the trigger, the loud crack echoed across the field. The man froze, then ran, disappearing into the darkness. I waited, rifle ready, but he never came back. The next morning, I called the sheriff and explained everything. They came out, took my statement, and walked the property. They found more evidence of someone breaking in over the past few weeks. Footprints, broken fences, even some tools left behind. It was clear that this person had been targeting farms in the area, sneaking in at night, and taking animals or destroying property. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. Relief that I wasn't imagining things, but fear that the person could come back. I spent the next few weeks strengthening the security on the farm. I installed cameras, reinforced every fence, and even dug a small trench around the chicken coop to make it harder to access. I stayed alert every night, keeping the rifle close and the dogs on watch. It wasn't comfortable, and I hated the fear that lingered, but it was better than being caught off guard. Months later, the sheriff called with news. They had caught someone who matched the description of the intruder. He had been living out of his truck and targeting farms in the area, stealing animals to sell them or using them to feed himself. He had a history of breaking and entering, and the evidence from my farm had helped connect him to other crimes. When they arrested him, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I finally slept through the night without worrying about footsteps in the dark. After that, the farm felt safe again. I repaired the coop completely, brought in new chickens, and the cows and dogs settled back into their normal routines. The nights were quiet once more, and I was able to enjoy the solitude I had always loved, but with a sense of vigilance I hadn't had before. I learned to trust my instincts and to take even the smallest sounds seriously. It had been terrifying, knowing that someone had been lurking around my home, so close that I could hear them scraping the ground, but I also learned that preparation and caution could make a difference. Now, when I walk through the fields at sunset, I still feel a flicker of unease sometimes, but I know that the farm is mine, that I've protected it, and that no one can sneak in without me noticing. The fear hasn't completely gone. It never will, but it has become manageable and life continues. The crops grow, the animals thrive, and the farm remains a quiet place in the middle of nowhere, exactly as it should be. I have always lived on my family farm, a small plot of land far from town, surrounded by cornfields and old oak trees. The nearest neighbor was more than a mile away, and the road leading to the farm was just a dirt path that turned into a rough trail through the fields. Life out here was quiet, slow, and solitary, and I had always preferred it that way. The farm had a rhythm. Wake early, feed the animals, repair fences, check on the crops, and do it all again the next day. It was hard work, but honest, and it kept me grounded. It was the middle of August when the unease started. That summer had been unusually dry, and the corn was brittle, the soil cracked, and the air heavy with heat. I had spent the whole day in the fields, inspecting the crops and pulling weeds. Sweat ran down my back, and the sun left my skin raw. By late afternoon, I was ready to get back to the house, drink a cold glass of water, and rest before dinner. When I stepped off the tractor and looked across the yard, something felt off. The goats were restless, bleating loudly, pacing back and forth near their pen. At first, I thought maybe it was the heat making them anxious, but their behavior felt different, urgent, panicked. I looked toward the fence that enclosed them and noticed that one of the gate latches had been bent slightly, just enough that it might give under pressure. My stomach tightened. I had always locked every gate, checked every latch. Nothing here was ever left unsecured. I went over and examined it closely. The metal was scratched and bent, as if someone, or something, had tried to force it open. The scratches didn't look like normal wear and tear. They were jagged, messy, and deliberate. I couldn't see anyone, but the thought that someone had been on my property without me noticing made a cold knot form in my chest. I grabbed a hammer from the shed and reinforced the gate as best I could, though I kept glancing around nervously, expecting to see a shadow moving in the cornfield beyond the yard. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little noise, the rustle of the wind, a branch scraping against the roof, the distant bark of a dog, set my nerves on edge. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the barn. My heart pounded and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped, then moved again, crunching along the gravel of the driveway. I wanted to grab the shotgun from under the bed, but I stayed frozen, hoping I was imagining things. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded, and I finally fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found more evidence that someone had been here. The back gate, which I was certain had been locked, was now wide open. The ground near the cornfield showed footprints, large, heavy, and uneven, as if whoever had made them was dragging something. I followed them carefully, keeping the dogs close, and discovered that several of the scarecrows I had placed along the field had been knocked down, torn apart, and shoved aside. It was deliberate, chaotic, and terrifying in its randomness. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They were testing me, leaving their mark, seeing how far they could go. I spent the day reinforcing every gate and door, checking the locks, repairing fences, and securing the chicken coop. I even set a few trip wires along the edges of the property, hoping they would alert me if anyone tried to come back. But that night, the intruder returned. I had gone to bed exhausted, but shortly after midnight, I heard the scraping again. This time, it was accompanied by a low, muffled sound, like something being dragged across the ground. My heart felt like it would explode. I grabbed the rifle I kept by the bed and slipped out the back door into the darkness. The moon was almost full, and its light cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound, and my flashlight cut through the dark. Near the edge of the cornfield, I saw movement. A figure was crouched low, dragging something heavy along the dirt. It was a man, wearing dark, tattered clothing, his face obscured by a hood. I couldn't see him clearly, but I could see the way he moved, deliberate, cautious, almost predatory. My hands shook as I aimed the rifle. I didn't hesitate. I fired. The crack of the gun echoed across the fields. The man froze, then scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the darkness beyond the trees. I stayed in place for a long time, rifle raised, waiting for him to return, but he never did. The next morning, I called the sheriff and explained everything. He came out to the farm, examined the damage, and took my statement. He found evidence of repeated intrusions, footprints, broken fences, and even tools left behind. It became clear that this man had been targeting farms in the area, sneaking in at night, stealing livestock, and vandalizing property. He had been careful, patient, and dangerous, and the thought that he had been moving around my land without me knowing was terrifying. I didn't relax for weeks. Every night, I stayed awake, listening for footsteps, rustling in the corn, or any sign of movement. I reinforced every building, replaced weak locks with stronger ones, and even added motion lights around the barn and yard. The dogs were always at the doors or windows, alert and growling at every sound. I refused to let my guard down. Couldn't. The farm had been my sanctuary, and now it felt vulnerable, exposed to the outside world in a way it never had before. About a month later, the sheriff called with news. They had caught someone who matched the description of the intruder, a man living in a stolen van near the highway, suspected of multiple break-ins across several farms. When they arrested him, they found some of the items he had taken from other properties, along with tools and equipment that matched the damage done on my farm. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a weight I didn't realize I had been carrying had finally lifted. The fear that had followed me through those long nights began to fade, replaced by cautious optimism. After the arrest, life slowly returned to normal. I replaced the missing chickens, repaired the fences completely, and even added some surveillance cameras to monitor the property. I kept the dogs alert, but they were calmer too, sensing that the threat had passed. The barn, the fields, and the yard felt like mine again. I could walk through the cornfield without a lump in my throat, check on the animals without scanning the shadows, and sleep through the night without listening for intruders. Even months later, I still felt a flicker of caution when the wind rustled the trees or a shadow moved too quickly across the yard. But it was different now. The farm was safe. I had learned to trust my instincts, to take threats seriously, and to protect my home with diligence and care. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had also made me more aware, more capable, and more connected to the land I had inherited. The farm remained my sanctuary, and I would do everything in my power to keep it that way. Life returned to its slow rhythm, feeding the animals, tending the crops, and keeping watch over my little piece of the world. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. The memory of those nights never entirely left me, but the fear had been replaced by confidence. I knew I could defend the farm, that I could face danger head-on, and that the solitude I had always cherished could still be safe. The farm, my home, was intact, my animals were safe, and the land was as steady and enduring as ever. I had survived something real, something dangerous, and I had come through it. And for the first time in months, I could walk through the fields in the fading sunlight without my heart racing, knowing that the farm and I were still standing. I remember that summer like it was a live wire humming under my skin. The sun had been scorching for days, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer over the fields and turned the dirt roads into something that could blister the soles of your boots if you weren't careful. I was on my uncle's farm that summer, alone, because he had gone into town for a few days and left me to keep an eye on things. Normally, I didn't mind. It was quiet out there, the kind of quiet that lulls you into a false sense of safety. But that summer, something felt off, though I couldn't have explained it at the time. The farm was huge, spread out across several hundred acres, with long fields of corn that bent in the wind like waves and pastures that held lazy cows chewing on dry grass. The barn was old, a massive wooden structure with the smell of hay and manure baked into its walls, and I'd spent plenty of hours in there helping with chores. That morning, I'd woken up before the sun fully rose, because I liked to get an early start. There was a storm forecasted later, and I wanted to make sure all the livestock had water and feed before the heat or rain got them. I started with the cows. There were 7 of them, all old and stubborn in their own ways. The water trough in the field was almost empty, and the cows were restless, stamping their hooves and swishing their tails. I grabbed the hose and started filling it, letting the cool water trickle in slowly, the sound loud in the quiet morning. One cow, Bess, a large brown one with a crooked horn, kept nudging me with her head. I waved her off, laughing to myself, thinking she was just impatient. After the cows, I went to check the cornfields. The stalks were high, over my head in most places, and the wind made them sway like a restless crowd. I noticed some leaves had been eaten, torn jaggedly, like some animal had passed through. Rabbits, maybe, or raccoons. Nothing unusual. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and continued, though a small, nagging unease crept into my chest. By noon, the sun was merciless. I decided to check the storage shed at the back of the property. It was a small, rusting building where old equipment and spare parts were kept. As I pushed open the creaking door, a wave of musty air hit me, along with the smell of oil and old wood. I glanced around, the shadows from the beams making the place look deeper than it was. That's when I saw the tire tracks. They weren't mine. I knew every path my old tractor left behind, every turn I had made that morning. These tracks were fresh, wide, and deep, like a large vehicle had passed through the muddy area near the shed. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here had driven through the back of the farm, and there was no reason for anyone to be there while my uncle was gone. I swallowed hard and walked toward the edge of the field, keeping my eyes on the tracks. They led toward the barn. My heart picked up pace, a dull thrum in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed the barn door was slightly open. It had been latched shut that morning. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Inside the barn, everything looked normal at first glance. Hay bales stacked in corners, cows lowing softly in their pens. The smell of the place strong and familiar. But then I noticed it. Some of the feed sacks had been cut open, spilled on the floor, and there were deep scratches along the wood near the tack area. It was chaotic, deliberate. Whoever had been here had been searching for something. I felt a chill despite the heat. I tried to think rationally. Maybe a neighbor had come by to check on things and hadn't told me. But the way the barn had been disturbed, the scratches, the tire tracks, none of it felt casual. I realized I needed to secure the farm. I went outside, keeping my eyes on the tree line, and grabbed my uncle's old shotgun from the corner of the porch. It wasn't loaded, but the weight of it gave me some sense of control. Hours passed. I moved from building to building, checking fences, locking gates, making sure the animals were safe. Every shadow seemed to shift strangely. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. The unease grew heavier as the day went on. Then, near sunset, I heard it. A faint crunching, like gravel under boots, coming from the side of the cornfield. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then it came again, slower this time, deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound, heart pounding. The corn swayed, and I moved carefully, shining the light into the thick stalks. That's when I saw them. Two figures crouched low, moving like they didn't want to be seen. I couldn't make out their faces, but their hands were dirty, and they carried small sacks, probably trying to steal feed or tools. My hands shook as I called out, though I didn't even know if they could hear me. They bolted, disappearing into the trees at the edge of the property. I ran back to the barn and locked the doors. My mind raced. I needed proof, something my uncle could use, so I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the tire tracks, the damage, the open feed sacks. I made a quick inventory of everything missing or disturbed. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky orange and red, and I knew I wouldn't get any more work done today. That night, I stayed awake, listening. Every sound from the nearby forest made me jump. When the wind shifted, I thought I heard whispers, but it was probably just the trees. I checked the perimeter one last time before going inside the farmhouse. The animals were safe and nothing had moved in the yard. I felt a small relief, though my nerves were frayed. The next morning, I called my uncle and told him what happened. He was furious and immediately drove back to the farm. Together, we inspected everything. The tracks led to a neighboring property where a few teenagers had been caught earlier that year trying to steal tools. It all made sense, the broken feed sacks, the scratches, the tire tracks. They had been planning it for weeks, waiting for my uncle to leave, and I had caught them in the act without even realizing it. We reported it to the authorities, and they caught the kids before they could strike again. The farm was secured after that, new locks, motion lights, and fences repaired. I stayed for the rest of the summer, but the unease never fully left me. I double-checked every lock, every gate, every fence. The memory of that day, the feeling of being watched and the unknown figures moving in the corn, stayed with me. But it also taught me something important. Vigilance was just as crucial as hard work on a farm. The world could be quiet, serene even, and still hide danger. By the end of the summer, when my uncle returned for good, I felt a quiet pride. The farm was intact, the animals safe, and I had faced a real threat without panicking. It wasn't a fairy tale or a ghost story. It was real life, and sometimes real life was scarier than any story you could imagine. But we fixed what had been broken, secured what needed protecting, and in the end, the farm felt like home again, safer than before, and I knew I could handle whatever came next. had always thought that working on a farm in the middle of nowhere was peaceful. My uncle's property was massive, hundreds of acres stretching in every direction, bordered by thick woods that looked untouched for decades. I'd come to stay for the summer to help with the animals and chores, and for the first week, everything seemed normal. The sun rose golden over the fields, the cows and horses moved lazily in their pastures, and the corn swayed in the wind like a living green sea. I felt a kind of calm that only comes with total isolation. But that calm didn't last. It started the day I went to check the northern pasture. I had walked the long dirt road that led past the barn, past the chicken coop, past the storage sheds, and finally to the fence that separated the pasture from the dense forest. The morning was dry, the kind of heat that makes the air heavy and sticky. I was carrying a bucket of feed for the cows, and I noticed something odd almost immediately. One of the gates to the pasture was swinging slightly. The latch had been secure the night before. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind, but the gate was heavy, and I knew the latch didn't move so easily. The cows were restless, too. They moved to the far end of the pasture, lowing nervously. I dumped the feed in their troughs, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on me. I walked along the fence line, scanning the edge of the woods. That's when I saw the footprints. Boots, large and deep, pressed into the soft dirt. They weren't mine, and they weren't my uncle's. My stomach sank. Someone had been inside the pasture while we were sleeping. I went back to the barn to check the doors and windows. Everything seemed fine there, but when I walked past the tool shed, I saw the padlock hanging open. The shed contained power tools and spare parts for the tractor, and now I was suddenly aware of how vulnerable everything on the farm was. My heart raced. Whoever had been here wasn't careful. They were bold. I spent the rest of the morning inspecting the perimeter. I checked the fences, the gates, and even climbed onto the roof of the barn to get a view of the property. Everything looked undisturbed, except for the patch of trampled grass along the tree line near the northern pasture. I made a mental note. Whoever had been here hadn't gone far. By midday, the sun was harsh, beating down on my back as I worked. I started on the animals, feeding the chickens, checking the horses' stalls, cleaning the barn. The smell of hay, manure, and sweat filled my nose, but it was familiar and grounding. Still, a thread of unease ran through me. Every sound, the creak of a gate, the buzz of flies, the distant rustle of leaves, set me on edge. That afternoon, I decided to check the cornfields. The stalks were taller than me now, thick and green, and the wind made them sway like waves. I was walking along the edge when I noticed something else. A piece of torn cloth snagged on a stalk, frayed at the edges, as if someone had brushed past it in a hurry. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just an accidental trespass. Someone had been in my uncle's fields, near the barn, moving through the property deliberately. I returned to the barn as the sun started to dip, painting the fields gold. The cows were settled, the chickens quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the storage shed again. The tools were there, but something felt wrong. The floor had scuff marks I hadn't noticed before, deep and messy, as if someone had carried heavy items in and out. I ran my hand over the scratches on the wall, feeling the rough wood under my fingers. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't an accident. This was someone looking for something, or planning to take it. I decided to secure everything. I brought the feed sacks into the barn, double-checked the locks on the gates, and even rigged a few makeshift alarms using cans and string around the perimeter. It wasn't much, but it was something. The sun went down, and shadows stretched across the fields, turning familiar shapes into threatening forms. I slept fitfully that night, waking at odd hours to check the windows and doors. Every creak and rustle of the house set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I woke early and went outside to check the fields. That's when I saw it. Tire tracks in the mud near the far edge of the property. Wide tracks, deep and fresh, leading straight from the forest toward the barn. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here yesterday had come back during the night. I followed the tracks carefully, moving along the edge of the cornfield. They led to the back of the barn, where I noticed a set of footprints that ended abruptly. I crouched, shining my flashlight into the shadows. There, pressed into the dirt, were scuff marks from shoes, small, quick steps that looked like someone had been sneaking. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. Were they still nearby? Had they come back to steal equipment or livestock? I grabbed the old shotgun from the barn loft, the weight of it grounding me as I moved cautiously. Hours passed with nothing happening, but the tension never left me. Every animal movement, every distant sound of a branch snapping, set my nerves on fire. The fear wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about real people, capable of real harm, moving silently on my property. It was raw and terrifying in a way I hadn't experienced before. By late afternoon, I decided to inspect the northern pasture again. The cows were calm, grazing slowly, but I noticed the fence line near the woods had fresh cuts. Someone had been trying to create a gap, and they hadn't finished. Whoever it was had planned to get in or out through there, but had been interrupted. I took photos and marked the spots, documenting everything carefully. As the sun set, I saw movement at the edge of the forest. A figure crouched low, moving along the tree line. I froze, trying to stay calm. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, but my heart didn't slow. I retreated to the farmhouse and locked every door, double-checking the animals' pens. I spent the night listening, tense and alert, the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. The next morning, I called my uncle and explained everything. He came immediately, furious but relieved that nothing had been taken. Together, we inspected the property, and the evidence made it clear. Teenagers from a nearby town had been scouting the farm, looking for tools, feed, or anything valuable. The tire tracks, the scuffed floors, the torn cloth, they had been planning it for days. The sheriff came, took statements, and eventually caught the group before they could strike again. In the weeks that followed, we fortified the farm. New locks, reinforced gates, motion lights, and a regular patrol path made the property secure. I stayed for the rest of the summer, watching and learning, always alert. But the farm gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm. The animals thrived, the crops grew tall and green, and the familiar sounds of the countryside replaced the tension. I had faced fear in a raw, real way and survived. I learned that real danger wasn't always obvious, but preparation, attention, and quick thinking could keep you safe. By the end of the summer, I felt a quiet confidence I hadn't had before. The farm was intact, the animals were safe, and I had proven to myself that I could handle the unexpected. That summer stayed with me forever, not because of any ghost story or fairy tale, but because it taught me the reality of fear, responsibility, and resilience. The farm had tested me, and I had met the test. I had always thought the farm would be quiet that summer. My uncle's property was far from town, nestled at the edge of a forest that stretched for miles, and the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. The air smelled of dry earth, hay, and animals. I was 16, spending the summer helping my uncle with chores while he was away on business. The work was hard, but I liked it. The rhythm of it, the feel of soil under my boots, the sound of cows lowing in the morning mist. But that summer, the isolation began to feel heavy, almost oppressive. The first sign that something was off came early one morning when I went to check the chicken coop. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in pale gold and pink streaks. I noticed the door to the coop wasn't latched properly. It swung slightly in the light breeze. I froze, scanning the yard. The chickens huddled together, feathers puffed, staring at the trees at the edge of the property. My heart beat faster. I had checked every door and gate the night before. Everything had been secure. Whoever or whatever had come through hadn't bothered to hide its presence. I finished feeding the chickens quickly, my hands shaking slightly, and moved to the cows. There were 10 of them, mostly old and stubborn, and they were all gathered near the far corner of the pasture, restless. As I carried buckets of feed toward them, I noticed hoof prints in the soft dirt that didn't match the cows. Human prints, boots, deep and heavy, pressed into the mud, leading from the forest to the fence. My stomach turned. Someone had been on the property while I slept. I checked the barn next. It was an old wooden structure, with hay stacked high and a lingering smell of straw and manure. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as I walked through, I saw the signs. Scratches along the walls, an overturned bucket, and patches of trampled hay. The feed sacks had been tampered with, torn open in a way that suggested someone had been looking for something. Whoever had been there hadn't cared about being careful. They had been methodical, searching, but clumsy. I spent the next few hours inspecting the perimeter. The fence lines were mostly intact, but near the northern edge, where the forest came close, someone had cut a small section of wire fencing, just enough to slip through. I took mental notes, noting the way the grass was crushed, the scuffs in the dirt. Whoever had come through here had intimate knowledge of the property. The thought made my chest tighten. By mid-morning, the heat was pressing down. I moved to the cornfields, which were tall and thick, rustling as the wind passed through. Walking through the rows, I noticed more signs. A torn piece of cloth caught on a stalk, deep indentations in the soil that didn't belong to any farm machinery, and broken branches hanging low. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I followed the tracks toward the barn again, only to see tire tracks leading from the edge of the woods. Wide, fresh, and deep. Someone had come back during the night, probably in a vehicle moving quickly. My unease grew as the sun climbed. I checked the tool shed, an old metal building near the barn, and found the padlock hanging loose. Inside, tools were scattered, some missing, some thrown about carelessly. Whoever had been here was looking for something. But what I didn't know. I felt the raw, primal fear of knowing that strangers had been inside my home, my uncle's farm, without my knowledge, and that they could come back at any time. I fortified what I could. I brought the feed sacks inside the barn, secured the gates, and even set up makeshift alarms with cans and string along the fence line. The day dragged on. I moved from animal to animal, checking water troughs, inspecting fences, and watching the edge of the woods constantly. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping branch, made me tense. The farm, usually so comforting in its isolation, now felt like a trap. I could be surrounded without realizing it. Nightfall brought no relief. I stayed up, listening. The wind through the trees sounded different somehow, sharper, deliberate. Every animal sound, a cow's lowing, a chicken flapping its wings, set my nerves on edge. I imagined figures moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I knew the threat wasn't imaginary. It was real, human, and capable of everything I feared. The next morning, I decided to check the northern pasture again. The cows were calm but uneasy, shifting nervously as I approached. As I walked the fence line, I saw fresh marks in the grass near the forest edge. Someone had been back during the night, probably trying to see if anyone had left. The fence cuts were deeper, more deliberate this time, as if the intruder had brought tools to widen the gap. My heart sank, but I forced myself to move methodically, noting everything. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the fence, moving quietly and keeping watch. I noticed movement along the tree line, figures crouched and moving slowly. I froze, heart pounding, and they vanished before I could identify them. I returned to the barn, securing every door and window. I documented the damage, the prints, the fence cuts. I called my uncle to tell him what had happened. He was furious but relieved I hadn't confronted them directly. He promised to return immediately. Within hours, my uncle arrived with neighbors and the sheriff. They inspected the farm and quickly connected the evidence. Tire tracks, footprints, and stolen tools led to a group of teenagers who had been planning to steal equipment and feed. They had been watching the farm for weeks, noting when my uncle left and when the property was most vulnerable. The authorities caught them before they could return, and everything stolen was recovered. We spent the next week securing the property. New locks, reinforced gates, motion sensors, and regular patrols made the farm safe. I stayed for the rest of the summer, but my sense of vigilance never left me. I learned to check gates twice, inspect every corner, and listen for the subtle signs that someone had been near. The rhythm of farm life returned gradually. The cows grazed calmly, chickens scratched the dirt, and the wind rustled through the corn. But the memory of that summer, the intruders, the isolation, the real fear, stayed with me. By the end of the summer, the farm felt like home again. I had faced real danger without panicking. I had seen the fragility of peace and the importance of vigilance. The animals were safe, the fields intact, and the property secure. I left with a new respect for responsibility and the quiet knowledge that life on a farm wasn't always peaceful, but it could be protected with careful attention and determination. The summer taught me something that books and stories never could. Fear could be real, tangible, and terrifying, but preparation, awareness, and quick thinking could turn it into safety, control, and survival.